Okay, so I actually recorded a video, start to finish, and I went back to watch it and there was no audio. I tried looking everywhere, tried going back and fixing it, but it's just not going to work. So what I'm going to do is kind of a hybrid. I'm going to go over some of the things I talked about before. I still have all the work that I did, so I'll pull some of that up as well. But basically, I'm going to cover all the principles that I talked about last time, and hopefully it'll be even better than the first time I recorded it. Okay, so we're in Photoshop here. Let me get rid of that. All right, and we have a sphere. If you've studied art or maybe you looked online, you've probably seen this demoed, but since I was asked about lighting, this is the best way to go through and explain it. So imagine that this shape here in the middle is a sphere, right? And our light direction is, just make a new layer real quick. Yeah, so our light direction is coming from the top left, okay? What you need to think about when you're lighting anything is where this object is in space in relation to the lights that are lighting it. So the first thing we do is we establish the light direction. Once the light hits the object, certain things are going to happen, and they happen every time. So before we deep dive into all the specifics of the different vocabulary to describe what's happening, the first thing you need to think about is that there are two families, the light family and the shadow family. And basically on this sphere, they're going to break down something like this, where this is the light family and this is the shadow family. And anywhere that the light goes, these shapes are going to change, but the rules will stay the same. There will always be a light family and there will always be a shadow family. And generally, all of the values, that's how light or dark or something is, all of the values in the light family will be lighter than all of the values in the shadow family. So let me start explaining what I mean by that, okay? So as we establish, our light is coming from the top left. And the first thing we're going to do is break it down, shadow family, light family. But we have a little bit more going on here. So notice in the middle, there's this bit of a gradient right here. And there's also, if I zoom in, you can see that it gets lighter right here. Well, what's happening is that when light hits an object, it breaks down in a pretty predictable way. So the surface will be lightest in the areas that are facing the light source because the light source is closer to them. And as the surface transitions away from the light source, it'll get darker. And in this transition point, we have what are known as halftones. Halftones are almost shadows, but they're part of the light family. So the halftones are lighter than in the shadows. Let me add this layer here. So now we've added this here, and that is called a highlight. So a highlight is literally the highest light. It is the lightest portion within the light family. And the highlight is the surface reflecting the light source to your eyes. So if we were to actually move our frame of reference and change where our head was in space looking at this, you can try this with an object you're looking at in real life. You'll notice that the highlight actually moves. The light source isn't moving, but our perspective is, and that's why the highlight will change on a surface depending on the angle you're looking at. As we transition away from the direction that the light source is, and go towards the shadow. Like I said, we have the halftones in here. And then right in this middle portion, there is a section where it stops being light and it starts becoming shadow. And that's known as the terminator. But an even easier way to think about it is this is known as a core shadow. So it's in the core or the center of the form. So cylinders, spheres, cones, all of these things will always have a core shadow. And that's just basically where the light family and the shadow family separate. And the core shadow is the darkest portion of shading on the form. And the reason why it's the darkest is because of this light section that I mentioned earlier. So as the light is coming in this direction, some of the light rays will actually miss the object and they'll bounce off the surface and reflect the environment back onto the object. That's why this section is known as reflected light. Even though it has the word light in it, it's not part of the light family. Reflected light is part of the shadow family. And if you see, let me just get a color drop here. So I'm selecting the lightest part of the shadow, the reflected light. Selecting that, I'm just gonna blow it up here. That's how dark it is. Now let me select some of the halftones, like the darkest part of the light family. And look, they're so much lighter. So even though it's called reflected light, it is in fact part of the shadow family, and it will be darker than everything in the light family. Now, the only time that rules like this are broken is if the surface is really reflective. So you think of like a chrome ball. When something's chrome or super reflective, it's just going to reflect everything in the environment. So if you imagine a situation where we had something like really, really bright over here, well, then it would reflect onto the surface of the sphere. But generally when you're shading, that's not really taken into account. Really, if you're doing like things that are metallic, really shiny, then you'll start to think about that. But for really basic, like introduction to lighting, we'll say that generally the shadow family is always darker than the light family. The other kind of exception to the rule is if things are in space. So in space, typically there's not anything around the object that would reflect light back onto it. So if you think about like a planet in space, the dark side of the planet will just be black because there's no light to reflect back onto it. So you actually won't have reflected light in space. But generally, we're not working in space. We're doing things that are on a planet. Most of the time, our things are, in fact, in an environment, so they will have reflected light on them. The last thing I want to mention is the cast shadow. So this sphere is not just floating in nothing, it's around something. There's an environment. So all of the light that hits it will cast a shadow in the direction that the light is going. So if the light is coming from this way, it's going to make an outline, or not an outline, but a shape representative of the form that the light can't pass through. So the cast shadow will follow the shape of what it's casted onto. So in this case, if we're thinking that this is like a flat plane here, that's why we have the shape like this. If this plane were curved, then the shape of the shadow would actually follow that curve. But for the sake of this example, it's flat just to keep things simple. In the cast shadow, it gets darker as it approaches the base of the form. Why is that? Well, once again, the light that is missing the object, hitting the surface and reflecting back onto it, it keeps doing that until it's no more. So, but each time it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and so things get darker and darker and darker until we end up down here. And that kind of process is known as occlusion. So when two objects get close to each other, the darkening in between those two objects is known as an occlusion shadow. So there's a cast shadow, then there's shadows that are on the form, and then there's occlusion shadows that happen when two objects are close to one another. And this happens no matter the distance. So if there's one object by itself, there's not going to be much occlusion. Once you introduce another object and they get closer together, now you start to see that occlusion happening more and more. As we get away from the form, the shadow lightens up because more light is in there, and it actually softens up the further away from the form it gets. So If you think of like shining a flashlight on your hand to make a shadow puppet on the wall, if you put your hand really close to the wall, the shadow will be really sharp. And if you pull away, it'll get bigger and it'll become blurrier. Same thing with the light source. Like if you put the flashlight really close to your hand, really close to the wall, it'll be sharp. Flashlight really far from your hand, it'll be kind of blurred. And that basically covers how lighting a form works. And I have the sphere labeled here. So everything we talked about is just kind of described there. And if you want this file, I will include it below the video for you to check it out and reference on your own. Just know that every form, no matter how big or small, will follow these rules. Okay? Now, how does that apply to what we're doing? So the request I got was to talk about lighting, and my friend who requested it, he's an anime tattoo artist, and so I thought this would be a great time to show how this works with something even more simplistic like anime, right? So it's not hyper realistic. We're doing a more stylized approach to designing. So how do we go from this line art here to something that's like fully shaded with light and everything like that? How do we do that? Okay, well, we're gonna kind of follow some basic steps here. So I already went through and did it before, so I'll just pull up the layer and I'll talk a bit about what's happening. So we have our arrow in the top right here telling us, okay, the direction of the light is kind of in front of her and it's coming from the top right. So knowing that, let's block in our basic shadow information. Boom, there it is. Okay, and the way that I did this is I just simply thought like, okay, her chest has like this plane and that seems to be facing towards the light. So I'm gonna leave it light. And then if you look like kind of like her upper stomach here, that's not facing the light. So I made it dark. And I applied that same logic everywhere on the form. So similar to the sphere where it's like the light's over here, this is shadow, I just did that for all of these things and I'm thinking really, really simply when I'm doing it. So if you imagine her head being a sphere and we just kind of generally broke it up like that, you can see that most of the stuff on this side is lit and most of the stuff on this side is in shadow. And you'll just kind of use your intuition on this. I used to get really hung up with trying to be ultra precise, like where exactly does the shadow go? You don't need to get that precise with it. You of course can take it as far as you want, but generally when you think about it, just ask yourself, is this facing the light or not? Is it in the middle? Is it more away from the light or is it more facing the light? Try to delineate them into two families and that's how you'll get this kind of look here. I think, yeah, I did a top-down lighting as well. So here it is, same exact process, but I put the light on top directly above her. So now everything that's facing up is getting light versus some of the stuff in front getting light. So the more that you work in this way, the more kind of intuitive it'll become, but it's not as complex as some of the drawings and artwork that we see makes it seem. There can be a lot to it, but if you just simplify it in your mind, it'll become so much easier for you. So first step, shadow family, light family. Now let's move on to the next one, which is this character, Power in this case, is not completely blank, right? She's not just totally white. Her clothes have a color to them. Her skin has a color to it, and all of these colors have a certain value, how light or dark they are. So let's think about how light and dark they are first. Boom, here we go. Now, this can be tricky in the beginning, but you need to separate the lighting information from the character of the surface that you are rendering. So in this case, we have the shadow family, we have the light family, and we also have how light or dark each section of this character is. So if I get rid of the shadow and light information, this is what we're left with. And this is what I'm talking about. So if her hair had no light hitting it, no shadow information, whatever, it's just existing in a different world where there's like no light, you just had to imagine, well, how light is it if it's not lit by anything? That's how you come up with these values here. So when you're looking at your reference and you're going, okay, her jacket is clearly darker, you need to account for what's happening once the light hits it. Okay, is the light making it a lot brighter in front? Like, what's the actual color of the jacket if it's totally flat, right? And that'll give you kind of this look. And then you can throw the shadow information on top, or you can do the shadow information first and then paint this underneath. It kind of, one follows the other. It doesn't really matter which way you go, but you need to think of them separately to understand better how things are working. Now, to take it a step further, she is not black and white. She does have color. So when you have the colors, you need to think about, okay, her hair is lighter. Is it more red? Is it blue? Like, what color is her hair? Turns out it's kind of pink. And follow the same kind of methodology, but this time we're talking about color. The main driving factor behind how something looks is the values, meaning the black and white version is the most important. So if you don't have the shadow information right, if you don't have how light or dark it is correct, then your drawing and your painting and your tattoo and whatever is not going to be successful. So get that information correct, then you add the color. And that's going to kind of start to resolve things. Now, we're going to start getting into some more kind of higher level explanations here. So a lot of people will take things this far, and that's it. They'll be like, boom, shadows, boom, lights, got the colors, I'm good to go. And you look at that and you go, okay, like, we're basically there. I can see what's going on. I know the colors are right, but how do we take this kind of to the next level, right? So when you're doing people in particular, people are alive, they're full of blood, their skin has all kinds of variations to the color to it. And so a kind of bad idea would be just to have gray as your shadows, right? The shadows are not going to be gray on a person because of what I just mentioned. So in this case, I actually warmed the shadows up, and you can already see, let me see if I can copy this here. So let's compare one to the other. So you can see if I compare these, the one on the right, the shadows look dead, devoid of life. The one on the left, the shadows look much more lively. We can sense that she's in somewhere that's maybe warm because the shadows are a warmer color. And this is the approach you need to take if you want to start like leveling up the way things look, especially if you're working in color. If you're working in black and gray, obviously everything's going to be black and gray. But for color pieces, you shouldn't be mixing black with the color to darken it. You should be pushing it warmer, cool, color transitions and that sort of thing. And we can get really, really deep into this stuff, but that's the basic rule that I wanted to talk about, which is you don't just want to darken things with black or gray. All right, let me get rid of that. All right, so now that we've kind of warmed up our shadows a bit, have a little bit more life to her, there's one last thing I wanted to go over in regards to this. There's something that happens when light hits a surface like skin, and it's called subsurface scattering. And basically, let me just do a little thing here. Basically, you can imagine that skin is this kind of like yellow color, and then underneath the skin is blood. So what happens is that the light comes down and it actually goes through the skin, it hits the blood, and it bounces back out and goes towards our eyes, right? So what'll happen when the light hits the blood is it takes some of that color with it, but it also takes some of the skin color with it. And when it finally reaches our eyes, we get this kind of like orangey look. Now, what does that look like in our image? So you will see this sometimes in artwork where people really, really push this effect, and it actually looks really nice. So I've done it here, and you can kind of see that. Let me zoom in, I'll turn it off and on. You can kind of see that there's like a glow suddenly. And it's like, oh, okay. Wow, that does look more interesting. It looks nicer. And right like on the edge here, right here on the edge, things are getting more saturated and more red. And that's exactly because of subsurface scattering. Let me go online real quick and find a couple examples of artists doing this. All right, so just pulled this off of Google real quick, and they're doing exactly what I'm talking about. So look at this shadow here. They have the shadow family, they have the light family, and then right in the middle, we have this kind of rise in saturation, this like orange kind of red line. You'll see this all the time in artwork, and it looks great. Basically, what they're saying is that the light is passing through the skin and it's picking up the blood and it's coming back out. You can see it here, you can see it here. If you've ever shined a flashlight on your fingers and they turn red, this is exactly what's happening. So use this in your work to just add an extra pop and an extra level of realism to it if you want it to be more successful. So we basically covered just about everything that you should know to get you started. I'm gonna go ahead and take this this drawing kind of all the way. I'm gonna make it a little bit more realistic. And let me know if you have any questions. I think I'll just do like a time lapse or something, and I'll just have like the finished piece. Maybe later I can do a video on like rendering. I think that might be helpful. But yeah, I think that's just about it. Let me know if you have any questions or anything. Alright, so that should do it. You know, you can spend as much time rendering as you want. I threw a couple hours on this and I kind of like where it's at. There's a few things I can tighten up, but basically you can kind of see how we went from this simple lighting information, light family, shadow family, to something more complex. Basically all of the shadows are delineated in the simple version, and we just kind of push things a little bit further in the more realistic version. This was really fun. If you have any more topics you'd like me to cover, let me know. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.